Hello, everyone. Hello, Dev Days Europe. Hello, DevOps Pro Europe. Sorry for the slight delay, but we are just about to start very interesting days packed of with entertaining sessions. My name is Sebastian Gamski. I'm a principal solution architect in AWS, and the person I have here is Mo Jawad, and he's at head of mobile in a company named Tiodo. He's a fan of React Native, and today he will tell you some very interesting things about multiplying one single white label application into several brands. So, without further ado, Mo, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Sebastian. Appreciate that. Really excited to be with you guys at Dev Days this year, and really keen to share these lessons that we've learned from building a single white label app for a company with over 60 brands. To start off, I want to put us into an imaginary scenario so that we can really understand this topic a little bit better. So imagine that you are a lead engineer at a fast food chain, international, called Burger Queen. The logo looks familiar. It's taken some light inspiration from a real brand. So you're joining in, and your first project is to create a mobile app. And the three main features within this app are to be able to view the restaurant menu, to be able to order food, and see any allergen information that exists. So you go away, you start to develop this app, and it takes about 6 months, and it's built out, and you start rolling it out to users, and everyone is happy. They are having their burgers at an even faster rate than before, and so everything is going well. And so you can see we've got some mock-ups here for the app. You can order a classic burger, a special burger, whatever have you. Everything is totally fine. And then suddenly the leadership team at Burger Queen has this big announcement that they're making. So let's go see what the announcement is. They have announced a completely new brand. So they are releasing a new brand on the side of Burger Queen called Burrito Bell. And they want to diversify. They want to go into the Mexican-inspired food space. So the next day, your manager comes in and says, say, you know that app that we built for Burger Queen? Could we just, make another one like it for Burrito Bell? And so you get started on the task. And then throughout the process, you realize there's actually a lot of similar requirements here. And maybe we can just take inspiration from the code that already exists in the Burger Queen app and use it for Burrito Bell. And it actually ends up taking 5 months instead of 6. Happy days. And we've got another app here. So you can go ahead, order your chicken burritos or your pulled beef burritos, whatever you have, and all is going well until yet again we've got some announcements coming up. And there is a totally new brand called Metro. So Metro is your build your own sandwich chain. Again, if the brand looks familiar, there's a little bit of light inspiration taken here from existing fast food brands. So your manager comes back to you again, and you have to go away to build another app. And as you get started through the process, again, you realize, these requirements are similar. So after another 5-ish months, you're able to build out the Metro app. Again, looking very similar, slight differences and variations, but ultimately the same functionality. You want to be able to view the menu, order items, and then see the allergen informations. And so this is getting a little bit out of hand because you're now managing these 3 apps at the same time, and it's a bit of a tough task. Now, good news, there's a recession. So management decides, let's stop expanding our brand so quickly and let's just focus on what we already have. So you, as the lead engineer, take a big sigh of relief, and you are no longer super concerned about how many different apps you're going to need to manage. 3 is somewhat manageable. Okay. Until your manager comes to you at some point and says, we want this new feature to show promotions, and we want it to be across all 3 of our apps. And we need this as soon as possible because we need to drive up sales as quickly as we can to weather out this recession. So you're sitting there and you're estimating and you're thinking to yourself, how long is this going to take me? Well, you've got 3 apps to manage, each of them probably a month, 3 months. But if you've been paying attention, you're in this kind of weird scenario now. You're managing and upkeeping 3 different apps, and each additional brand that gets added or each subtype of an app that you've got, your workload is increasing. This is a bit of a weird risk to play with, and you don't want to be in this position. If you want to add one new feature to all of these apps, it's going to take you 3 times the time. And you're thinking there, wouldn't it be cool if we had a single app that was managed from a single code base and you could easily mold it and shape it to each of your brands and businesses? Something like this. What if one code base could be the same app for, it could be targeting the Burger Queen app, the Burrito Bell app, and the Metro app? So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to be focusing on white labeling, which is really this core concept here. Before we jump into the meat of it, a little bit about me. So as Sebastian mentioned, my name is Mo. I am the head of mobile at this company called Theodo based in the UK. I've been interested in mobile development since I was 13, so I built my first app in Objective-C. It was admittedly not a very well-programmed app, but it got into the App Store, and it was something that I was very, very proud of. And over time, that interest has stayed with me. So these days, I'm really focused on cross-platform app development with React Native, mobile DevOps, and trying to push the boundaries of how much you can combine web apps and mobile apps together. So you see my Twitter handle there as well. If you'd be interested in chatting or learning more about some of the stuff that I work on, feel free to shoot me a message afterwards. The content of this specific talk is actually inspired from a real project that we worked on. It's with this client called Immediate Media. So Immediate Media is one of the biggest publishers in the UK. What they have is they have 60 plus brands of magazines and publications that they're releasing on a regular basis. So they wanted to come into the digital space. And one of the challenges that they faced was how do we break into this digital market and not have to manage a single app for each of these 60 different brands that we have. So what we did was we built a white label app with them in React Native, and ultimately they could target this for any of the sub brands that they have. So the ones that we've worked on existingly are History Extra, which is a popular history themed magazine, if you can guess by the name of it, in the UK, and also BBC Good Foods to get recipes and whatnot. So all the content is to say we are taking these learnings from a real world project and trying to condense them into this talk. So let's jump into it. What is white labeling? White labeling is this approach of abstracting away the skeleton of your application and from that producing multiple apps that are tailored and designed and customized to match the specific look of that brand or product that you're targeting. They can display data that's relevant to that brand, so they're not necessarily all displaying the same data either. There's some restriction on flexibility, but we'll get into that in a bit. And they could point to totally different backends and totally different APIs. They also can be published with different names, icons, and hence bundle IDs to the app stores. So what that means is effectively, in the case of the fast food businesses that we saw, that one code base could generate a Burger Queen app, a Metro app, and a Burrito Bell app. And all three of these apps can live side by side on one single phone. It's not one app. They're targeting 3 separate apps at the same time. So benefits of white labeling here are effectively reusability and feature parity. If you dig into these, really, the fact that you are able to create multiple branded apps from a single code base and to reuse code to such a degree means that your development time is going to be insanely faster, especially as you start to add more and more and more brands. And so what you can do is you can use more efficiently your resources to actually build features and things that matter to your users. There's also the maintenance side of it. It's easier to maintain and fix bugs or add new features because you are managing one code base. So feature parity is going to be maintained across the board. If you fix a bug on one of the apps, it'll be reflected across all of them, which is a big plus when you're having such a big task of managing these different ones. So when do you need a white label app? What are the telltale signs that you might need to start considering white labeling as a part of your strategy? Firstly, if the core of your functionality is the same across multiple apps with only sort of minor differences, it is a pretty good sign that white labeling could be a good option. So in the case of our fast food apps, the features are the same. You want to browse a menu, you want to order food, you want to see allergen information, maybe you want to explore and see what restaurants are around you. This is all really kind of the same set of functionalities, but with different brands under the hood. From a UI perspective as well, when you look at it, if your components can look and feel the same, then this is a good sign that white labeling could be a good option. In our case, we had menu items for different foods that you could order. And each of these might have an image, a header, and a price, maybe with some ratings and stuff like that. It's really the same data that needs to be displayed. And we could choose to display them the same from a UI perspective with only modifications on the colors, maybe the fonts. So we can keep some level of customization, but really make the core of these the same. And then lastly, if you're finding that the backend calls and the data shapes are not drastically different from each other, this is also a really good plus, and it means that you can white label sustainably. So there's multiple ways that this could play out. One is that you might have a unified fast food backend. So what that means is you have one backend that will deal with all of the requests, whether you're going to Burrito Bell or you're going to Burger Queen, and the data and the shape of it is all the same. So that's great because then it's unified across the board. Or in some cases, you might have separate backends for each of the sub-brands, but the data shape is still the same. So if that is the case, and there's minimal differences there, then you're probably in a good state to be able to white label. So let's say we've hit some of these criteria and we feel comfortable to take the strategy on board. Great. So how do we build one? Let's break it down into 3 phases. And I'm taking a very high-level abstract approach to how we're defining the phases of building an app. But let's break it down into a design phase, a development phase, and a deployment and publishing phase. So start off with the design phase. It's notorious that developers and designers have different approaches to building apps. So there's some level of tension usually there to say, like, designers might want some additional features or some functionality that looks really nice, but developers, it might take a lot of time to do that. So we need to break out of this barrier because white labeling is effectively both a design and a tech challenge. So one of the things that we did was we were trying to ensure that we bring the designers along with us in this process. We started off together and we designed a slate application. What do we mean by a slate application? We mean an application that isn't tied to a specific brand. It's just a generic white label application that doesn't have a look or a feel, but it's kind of the bare bones skeleton of what can be implemented by each of the sub brands. So we started off with our slate application. We defined what we call atoms, molecules, and organisms, and went and built bigger and bigger sort of abstractions within our design system. So what you do is with your design team, you start and you define basic design tokens. How many different color variations are you going to support? What font sizes are you going to support? Are you going to have 3 different font sizes that can be used in the app, or are you going to use just 2, so on and so forth? What spacings are going to be allowed? What is going to be the unit of spacing that you're going to be using? And then from that, once you've got your design tokens, you can start to talk about your atoms. How much flexibility do you want to allow for a button? Like, do you want it to have 3 different variants, maybe a primary, secondary, and a link variant? Do you want to allow the behaviors to be modified? And how many different behaviors should the button really support? Because this is a generic component, right? And so you continue this exercise and you build more and more complex components together, but in the form of a slate application that isn't tailored to any of your specific sub-brands. I'm a mathematician by sort of study, and so I like to think of these in terms of formulas. So complexity, roughly, is correlated with the number of components to the power of the number of variants. So what you're then needing to think about with your design team is there's a lot of trade-offs that need to be made here. The more variation that we allow within our components from a design system perspective, the more complexity we're going to add into our application, and the harder it is going to be to develop, and the harder it's going to be to maintain as well. So this is then something that you tackle together with the design team, the development team, and the design team, tackle this problem of reducing complexity as much as possible while still keeping the app looking nice and behaving and functioning in a way that is useful to the users. Which leads to our first learning. So ensuring that the whole team is bought into the vision of white labeling. Everyone needs to see the benefits of taking the white labeling approach. Everyone needs to know that it's not going to be feasible to manage tens, of different apps at the same time. So if everyone, including the design team, is aligned with this vision, then you're all going to be fighting against the beast of complexity and trying to reduce it as much as possible. Great. So we've gone through the design phase. Let's look at development. From an architecture perspective, there's actually 2 main components to a white label app. There's the white labeled source application, and that's common across all of your different brands. And then there's going to be configurations for each of the apps that will modify the source app to match the brand and match the feel and the data of that specific brand. And equally important, which we'll look at in a bit, is a good build system that combines these 2 together. So what lives in each of these? Let's break down what is in the white label source app. So business logic, common constants, types and configs, your components, your screens, the state management, and the navigation. These all live within the white label source app. They're all shared across the board. And let's go into a little bit more detail about each of these. So your logic across your apps should be the same. These are implementing the feature sets that are common, right? That's why you white labeled the app to begin with. Your feature sets were common, and hence the business logic should be very much the same. You want to minimize any discrepancy and any differences within the features. If you add too much discrepancy into the business logic, it becomes difficult to manage. So in the example of our fast food application, when you're ordering an item, if you can keep the business logic of that flow the same across the multiple apps, then you're making massive savings in terms of the complexity of what you need to manage. Moving on to common constants, types, and configurations. There's a lot of configurations for your application that can be largely shareable. And you will still have some app-specific configs, but by and large, these are going to be vastly shareable across the board. There's one bit that I want to focus when it comes to constants, types, and configs, which is themes. So it's important within your white label app to define a universal sort of theme type. So what you're basically defining is saying, like, here are the values of different customizations that I'm going to accept for each of the brands. And so you say and you define the shape of what each app is going to implement. So if we look here in TypeScript, and all of the examples going forward are going to be sort of TypeScript, React Native examples. Hopefully that these concepts are really kind of extensible to any other platform, but just for the sake of simplicity, we're going to go with the TypeScript approach here. So you can see we've defined an interface for the type of theme colors. Let's say our apps want to support both light and dark themes. We define within that maybe a primary color. We define a secondary color. We can define some variations here for the different colors that we're going to accept within our white label application. Similar thing for sizing. Maybe we want to define like 3 different sizes that are going to be accepted for text, a small, a medium, and a large. So these are the shapes of the types that we're going to accept for the customizability and for the themes. Again, if you reduce the number of different variants that you have here, the better, because then that means that you are effectively cutting down on the complexity of it. From these themes, then, we can move on to components. These components that we define are mapping one-to-one to our design system. So you're effectively implementing the design system that you came up with in the design phase. And it is also using the theme types that we just saw on the slide before that. So in the case of our order menu, we had those little hearts to favorite items that you like the most in our fast food chains. And so you can see the color of these buttons can be different because they implement different themes effectively. I've got a code example here from a React Native button. It's very, very simple, but I want to show how it can get complex. So the button takes in a title, a function like a callback for an on press, and a Boolean that says whether this is a primary button or a secondary button. And just off the bat, you can see that there's a lot of logic here that's added to modify the background color depending on if it's a primary button or a secondary button. Some of this can be abstracted away, but really you're adding complexity here into how the styles look just from adding one variation here. And then if you start to combine these together, there's going to be a lot of complexity that's added here. The good thing is you're doing this once for your entire design system, and then across the apps, you don't have to worry about it much. But it is something that is going to be important to consider because any complexity is best to be avoided if possible. So that's one thing to consider on the component side. Once you've got your components, you can start to look at screens. And so your common feature set is going to be defined in your screens. The screens are really sort of the glue between everything here. You're taking your business logic that you defined a bit earlier, you're taking your components, and you're basically combining these together. So if we look at the example here, we've got an order food screen. All of this logic and the functionality of that screen should be the same. And so when you tie these together, you come with this modularized approach. You've got an order food module to some degree. And this is really going to be beneficial for saving time in the long run. And I'll talk about why in a second. State management as well ties into that screens and features concept. So if you try to split out your state management into features and into screens, this is going to be really beneficial. There is a limitation here that it's tied to some degree to the external APIs. The external APIs and the backend calls that you're making are going to define how your state management is going to be designed inside of your actual application. But one of the nice things is if you have a global state for your entire application, let's say for the fast food application that we've got, and you can split it up into different sub sort of state management stores, then effectively what you have is you have modularized state as well. One of the great libraries that actually embraces this model is XState. So you can combine sort of finite state machines, FSMs, and you can take feature FSMs and build a global finite state machine, which has the entire app's application state. So that's one of the things that can be good, because then you're effectively modularizing your screens, you're modularizing your state management. And when you tie these together, you have almost feature modules that are exclusive from each other, which then ties into the navigation. So the added benefit, once you've started to take this modularized approach with your screens, your features, and your state management, is that through navigation, you can effectively add or remove features that are app specific. What do I mean? Let's say in the Burger Queen app, you have a functionality to look for nearby restaurants, whereas on the Metro app, you don't want to actually support that. Or you have notifications on the Burger Queen app, but on the Metro app, you actually don't need that bit of functionality. What you can effectively do here, if you look at the bottom tab there, what we've got is we've got 5 icons showing that there's sort of 5 set of screens or 5 features within the Burger Queen app. But on the Metro app, there's only 3 of them. When you've modularized and taken that modularized outlook, effectively you can add or remove these from an app-specific level, and it gives you that little bit of extra functionality and that little bit of extra feature that you can tailor and tweak depending on the brand. And that was our second learning. We realized throughout this process that when you look at things from a modular perspective, you can reduce the complexity of the application greatly. They're not all tying in together, and there's a good level of separation of concerns here, which means that the app isn't as complex as it could be. Great. So ultimately, what we did was we put all of the white label application logic within the source folder. So all of that lived under the SRC directory. So what was ultimately here in the final folder structure was components. And within this, we're using atomic design. So we define atoms, molecules, and organisms. And then we also had some constants living here. We had some features here. So if you look at the folder structure, we actually define the features here. And then within those features, the screens lived there, the state lived there. Maybe there were some helpers as well. And then lastly, on the top level, we had the navigators and the types. So we've built our white label source. How do we implement it for each of the specific applications, for each of the specific brands that we have? We then broke down the configurations. So this is Burger Queen specifically, or Metro specifically, or Burrito Bell specifically. What is the brand specific stuff that needs to live separately from the white label app? Firstly, it's the assets. So your icons and some of the assets like logos and images and whatnot that you might have are going to be different across the different brands. So these live separately from the white label source. The other bit is the app config. So on App Store, applications that go out into the App Store, the way they distinguish a unique version of the app is through a bundle ID. So when you have a bundle ID that's different from another app's bundle ID, it says that these are totally separate applications. So that's the unique sort of identifier to say this is an app. So what we want to do is we need to be able to configure the bundle ID. We need to be able to change the app name as well, depending on which application it is. We might want to change the endpoint. Maybe it's pointing to different backends, as well as other environment variables that are necessary. Themes and localizations are the other things that we wanted to keep separate for each of the brands. I'll go into themes in just a sec with a little bit more detail, but in terms of localizations, what we mean by that is maybe you want to support different text being shown on different screens for each of the applications. So what we can do is we can abstract that away in for each of the brands and keep the strings of text that you want to display on each of the applications within the localizations for that specific brand. On the theme side, if you look at the left-hand side, that was what we had in the white label app. We had a theme type definition, and we said our theme colors are going to be these different variants, and this is what we accept in terms of customizability. On the right-hand side, what we have is we have an implementation of those theme colors and those theme sizes. So effectively what we have is we say, okay, for the Burger Queen app, I want the primary color to be this specific hexadecimal. And I want the secondary color to be this specific hex color, and so on and so forth. Similar thing for the sizes. We say, for the Burger Queen app, I want the size, I want the small sort of size here, font size, to be 2 points, and the medium to be 6, and so on and so forth. One of the other things that you can theme here is the fonts. You can have different fonts, and that would also live within your assets folder. Effectively, if you look at it from a bigger picture, what we had was we had the source directory, which was the white label app. And then on the same level as the source directory, we had an apps folder under which we define each of our applications that are going to be published separately for each of our brands. Within, let's say, the Burger Queen app, we had assets, we had config, and we had themes. Which leads us now to the deployment and publishing phase. So we now have these almost like two separate independent projects, and it's going to be really important to have an effective build tool that can take the two and combine them together. So an app for us is the white labeled source app plus an app specific config going through some sort of build pipeline to build a target application. And the goal of this sort of build pipeline that we're creating here is to effectively combine the assets and the configs and the themes from the app-specific brand implementation with the white label source app to create a total package of an application that we can then deploy and push to the App Store. When you combine the folder structures together, it kind of ends up being something like this. You've got a full directory like any other React Native application that's got the assets, the components, configurations, and the features, the navigators, and the themes and everything combined together. So it's a full-fledged app, and this is then ready to be sort of built into an IPA or an APK format and then sent out to the App Store to be published and given out to users. Cool. So that's kind of the components and going through the chronology of how you would build this application with the considerations that you would have. I want to take a look at some of the challenges that we faced. And this is where I think a lot of the learnings came out of. So the first challenge that we faced was, in reality, data is going to look different. When you're working on these big organizations, one of the things that will happen is that the data is going to look different across different brands and products. They probably have different teams managing the backends, and it's going to be a bit of a challenge to have a unified set of data coming through. So that kind of has a domino effect and adds so much complexity into the app if it's left unchecked, because you're going to have to manage different data formats and different state management and then different screens and then different components for each of the sub-brands, kind of defeating the purpose of the white labeled app, right? So the potential solution that we saw was, why don't we just put a middle layer into here and we define a backend as a front end to handle the data transformations and unify the API layers. So effectively what that backend for front end does is it's responsible for querying the Burrito Bell backend or querying the Burger Queen backend and taking the data and constructing it and restructuring it in a shape that will be consumable by our white label application so that the data is unified. This does come with more overhead and cost, but it is ultimately, we found it's a better trade-off to make because it's easier to manage on the back-end side rather than on the front-end side. So learning 3 was handling data transformation outside of the app simplifies the architecture greatly. Now, another challenge that we found was that in some cases, you will absolutely need some custom components, right? Like it's not going to be realistic to assume that the apps are going to be absolutely identical. And what happens if it can't live on separate screens? We saw the case with the Burrito Bell and the Metro app that they had different tabs within them that had different sets of screens and different sets of features depending on which app it was. But what if you wanted to actually have an extra feature added into an existing screen that's shared across the apps? So maybe you want to, instead of a feature, you want to have a don't show button for a menu item that only lives on the Burger Queen app. What do we do in that scenario? How do we handle the differences where it's on the same screen? Maybe you use feature flags, right? Everyone loves feature flags. They're great, right? Not so much. While Sheldon Cooper might be interested in flags, what we found is that a code smell that you can see very quickly on if the white labeling approach isn't working as it must is that you're starting to get a lot of if-else blocks and you have a fair bit of spaghetti code. So that's going to be a good telltale of where you need to take a different approach. Maybe that's fine for 2 apps if you have a lot of if-else blocks in your code. What about dozens? What about the 60 apps that we're going to need to eventually support for our client? We need a more extensible solution. One of the ways that we then approached this was we looked at using that backend for front end that we defined to handle the component rendering to some degree. What do we mean by that? We say when we have a layout of, let's say, a home screen, could we just send a JSON blob that defines what components should get rendered into a screen? The trade-off here is that you've got one big file to maintain with a lot of if-else statements, and it's a lot of conditional rendering. But because it's all centralized into one section and into one file, it is very much extensible still. And you kind of take all of that spaghetti code and you put it into one place where you're managing it and looking at it very, very clearly. And you can put a lot of tests in place to avoid there being regressions there. So the fourth learning that we had was watch out for a lot of branches in your code. It's usually a smell for places where white labeling doesn't work or where you need some sort of more extensible solution that works in hand with your white labeling. The last challenge that we had was dependency management. So dependency management is difficult on any day, but when you want to have multiple applications, it can become even more challenging. So how do we handle dependency management in an extensible way? What if you had a dependency that one app needed, but another one didn't? One of the examples that we found within our the application that we built was one of our applications needed an AV library to be able to play back audio from podcasts or play back videos from a specific documentary. But our other app didn't really need that. So how do you handle that discrepancy of dependencies? Why is this important? Well, as you add these dependencies, your bundle size is going to grow. And you don't want to unnecessarily add to your bundle size when the feature isn't going to even be used by a variation of the app. So that is one challenge. The other side is, do we want to support different versions of the same library depending on the app? So let's say we want to use version 3 of a specific library on the Burrito Bell app, but we want to still use version 2 on the Burger Queen app. Do we have to support that? Ultimately, we opted against this, and we decided to unify our dependency management across the board. We decided to also take the loss with trying to keep the same dependencies, even if they're not going to be used by the apps. This was where it's important to really look at and think about the feature sets and make sure that there is a high level of commonality. Otherwise, you're effectively increasing a lot of waste by including these unnecessary libraries into your application. So this was a trade-off that we very consciously made. And so our learning was that managing different dependencies when we tried in a monorepo was a big challenge. It's best to avoid it as much as possible so that you don't add more and more complexities into your app. There are some really good solutions out there that can help you. Things like NX and Turbo Repo can help a lot. But again, the challenge here is that you're adding more and more complexity into your application. So those were kind of the big 5 learnings. Let's just summarize them again quickly. To start with, first, the vision is so important. Make sure that the entire team is bought into this vision of white labeling. Bring your designers with you across. The second one is you want to have that modularized outlook. When you're defining your app's feature sets, try to look at it and see how you can separate them up from each other and how you can modularize it. It's going to help reduce complexity a fair bit. The third learning that we had was data transformation. Try to keep that as much as you can outside of your white label application. Try to keep all of that within maybe a backend layer that handles that for you so that you don't have to worry about that inside of your white label app architecture. A code smell is going to be branches of code. So try to look for places where white labeling doesn't work and try to find a more extensible solution like the JSON blobs that we did. And lastly, dependency management. Try to unify your dependencies as much as possible across the applications. It's going to save you a lot of headache and a lot of stress. Thank you very much for listening. I would have loved to be in person with you this year, but unfortunately I wasn't able to. So hopefully in the next year we can catch up more in person. But in the meanwhile, feel free to scan the QR codes to either add me on LinkedIn or feel free to follow me on Twitter and shoot me a message. More than happy to have a chat about white labeling or anything else mobile related. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mo. This was very interesting presentation. Personally, for me, it was very interesting because I typically look at similar applications from the perspective of server side. So building a multi-tenant SaaS platform. So your perspective from the side of a front-end developer is actually very interesting. We have one question. The question comes from Anton's Cornice, and the question is, how do you approach Q&A for such application? Do you run tests for each sub-brand or only for original app?
It's a very good question because we recently had a conversation about white labeling or extensible apps for a client within the healthcare sector. And so depending on if you have certain regulations or certain needs from a QA perspective, it can actually become quite complex. So in the healthcare industry, one of the QA requirements was that you need to check every single app that has a different bundle ID and a different build process. So effectively what we needed to do was we needed to test every single sub-brand and take it through a QA process. So that's a challenge that you might have to face if there are regulations in place. typically what we like to do is we like to have sort of a pragmatic approach between having some end-to-end tests that are going to run, and you can kind of unify the end-to-end tests that you run. So a really cool end-to-end testing framework that's come out recently for mobile is called Maestro. And you can effectively define your end-to-end tests, and it runs in an emulator with YAML, and it's a lot more sort of stable than previous end-to-end testing frameworks for mobile were. So we would define maybe some Maestro tests, write some unit tests for some of the bit of logics that is quite difficult, and we would try to unify the QA. What we would do maybe with the end-to-end tests is run them on the separate apps in sort of parallel, just to make sure that there's no app-specific regressions. But again, because you're having one white label source of an application, there isn't going to be, it's not sort of different apps that you're managing. So we try to unify the QA as much as possible for the applications.
Thank you very much. All right.
Awesome.
I hope you folks have enjoyed the session. Thank you very much, Mo, again. And well, see you everyone around in the next session across the whole day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Captain.